As David Letterman is fond of saying, our guest tonight needs no introduction. Certainly not if you were teaching in Southeast Asia anywhere between 1999 and 2007. Bob Gross is a retired superintendent of schools. He now lives in Minnesota. He spent 35 years in public education as a teacher, principal, assistant superintendent, and superintendent in the United States. In 1999, he was appointed superintendent of schools at Singapore American School. From 2007 to 2012, he worked with the Office of Overseas Schools with the U.S. Department of State, calling on international schools in Western and Eastern Europe. From 2012 to 13, he served as interim school superintendent at the American School in Abu Dhabi. In 2013 and 14, he served as interim school superintendent at the American School in Vienna. His last international school assignment was as interim school superintendent at the International School of Basel in Basel, Switzerland. In 2006, Bob was named the International School Superintendent of the Year. What a resume. During this interview, we drew on Bob's vast experience as a head of school in multiple regions of the world. We talked about whether to go global or not, some steps to take to begin the recruiting process, what school leaders look for in candidates, communicating with prospective schools, some do's and don'ts when attending recruiting fairs, some tips about managing schools, what being an interim head of school entails, and a few insights on various regions to teach in. Bob gave super helpful tips, so I suggest you have a pen and a pad of paper handy when you listen to this episode. This episode was recorded on October 13th, 2022. Here we go with the legendary Bob Gross.
Hello, Bob.
Hello, David.
We're so excited to have you on the Educators Going Global podcast, and I want to start you off with our starter question. So where in the world are you, Bob?
I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. I am a retired international school educator, and we have retired to Minneapolis to be close to grandchildren.
Wonderful.
Right.
So, Bob, we tend to have a guiding question because, we're teachers. And our guiding question for today's episode is,
Yes.
what advice would you give to US-based teachers who might be considering trying international teaching? And we would like to start off by asking you to maybe tell a little going global story of your own that kind of ties into that question, if you would.
Well, thank you. I think for me, because when you first head into international education, you can find yourself wondering, will this ever happen for me? And that is clearly a case I went through in wanting to pursue international education. I was in public education for 31 years prior to deciding to go international. And then how do you get someone to take a look at your resume? And so for me, that was a challenge because I wound up applying, and people said, well, you haven't left the States for quite a number of years, and what makes you think you can survive in the international school community? And so I applied to 5 different places in South America, in Germany, in Egypt, and in Singapore, and got rejected by 4 of those folks before they even cared to talk to me. It was just simply because the boards had indicated they want somebody with international school experience. And I think a lot of the beginning teachers are going to take a look at that and hear that sometime. You're not going to get, I'm going to give some preference to people with international education as opposed to someone who hasn't gone internationally. And I pursued that rather strongly with the search committee recruiter. And also, fortunately, someone from the school board in Singapore picked up my resume and said, well, what about this guy? And so there's a long story in between that moment yet. But the point I'm making here is, don't give up just because you start receiving maybe some rejections from some places, and
Right.
because you never know when Some place picks up your resume and takes a good look at it, or some individual, and all of a sudden you're in the running. And so clearly that's what happened to me in Singapore. And fortunately, I was able to get the position. Probably, what some people would consider one of the better international schools in the world.
Mm,
For I certainly didn't have that in mind when I first made the application. However, again, basically what I'm saying here is persevere.
right. Well, and I will say,
Mm.
from the other side of things, having worked with you as our head, Singapore American School got lucky that that board member picked up your resume because you were an awesome head, Bob.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, we managed to establish, I think, a very nice culture there and work together as a team. Parents, faculty, students, administration, and that's the way it should be, and that's the kind of environment that all of us hope we wind up, stepping into.
And that's such a great guiding mantra for life in general, but for international teachers. I'm reading a book right now all about recruiting. Even though I've done it many times, it keeps changing and it's so competitive. And the writer really gets into the trepidation and the worry and the like going to a fair and how intense it is. So that's great to hear from someone who's been recruited for the big job to just stick with it and keep trying and see what happens. So thanks for that.
Yeah, because there's no downside in not. You may as well pursue it right to the end. What's the worst thing that can happen to you if you do that?
Right.
So yeah, please pursue it, persevere, and something good may come about.
Excellent. All right. So digging down a little bit, are there any specific considerations you might suggest to potential international educators that they keep in mind when making the decision whether to go or not to go global? So, just that very first step, what would you offer? What kind of advice would you get them to think about?
Well, the first thing I think that many of us, particularly in the U.S., perhaps we might think about, I want to go to a certain region of the world. And I think that you really need to talk that through with your spouse, if that's who you're going to be traveling with, or yourself, just to reflect on that. And try not to limit yourself geographically, because there are, I mean, frankly, I was guilty of doing that a little bit as well, hoping I would get Europe. And it turns out I got Singapore, and that was such a much better situation for me. Okay, so I would first of all encourage people not to dwell so much, unless there was absolutely a specific reason you have already decided that the only way you're going to go international is if you can go to this particular region. All other regions have been excluded. Just know you may at that point then really limit yourself to possibilities, number one, and grand experiences that you never knew were out there. So please keep that in mind right away, is try to not limit yourself geographically. Talk it over well with your, again, if you have a spouse. And I might mention, this might be a good point right up front to say that many schools, probably 95% or more of the schools you're going to be applying to, wind up paying for your travel expenses, to come over to teach, and then also at the end of the year to travel expenses to go back again. So they're going to be hesitant sometimes in hiring people with trailing spouses or individuals who have quite a number of children, particularly two or three. So sometimes that can be a limiting factor when you're competing against maybe another single individual that doesn't have that, because again, when they hire somebody with a trailing spouse, they wind up paying for two airfares, and if there are additional children, they wind up paying additional airfares. And so sometimes, again, when you're competing against maybe another couple or individual who doesn't have some of that other extra, if it comes down which one should I take, they may take the one that's going to be least expensive to them. So that's not to discourage anyone from traveling with a trailing spouse or has children, but just know it may be a factor. And again, talk through well with your family, your spouse, if that's the case, why it is that you want to do this.
Right.
Are you prepared for it? Some of them that I have encountered, some of the people I've encountered, I think looked on it as a little bit almost like a vacation.
Huh.
You know, and oh, this will be grand. We get to do this, we get to do that. And this is very serious work you're
Yeah.
signing up for. Like teaching, and I mean, it is so, as I don't need to tell teachers, it's incredibly challenging. The same thing will be expected when you land wherever you land internationally. It is expected that you're really going to stick to the knitting, that you really open yourself up to extracurricular opportunities. That's all stuff that I think you should know and think about before even applying. Be prepared for that expectation from the other end. And so I guess I'd leave it at that for the moment. But again, make sure you want to go international for the right reason and know that a lot of those travel opportunities are going to come along that you no doubt are really looking forward to, but really focus on the job itself and imagine yourself teaching at this place. And again, all the preparation that goes into that. And schools just love people who are also going to take on extracurricular activities because very often they're short of people who are willing to take on that extra responsibility.
Right. And I'm just going to clarify one of the terms you use there, trailing spouse. Maybe some people might not be familiar. The idea being a non-teaching spouse who would be joining you at
Yeah,
your,
yeah, thank you.
yeah,
Sure.
in your new country. So they would need, housing for a couple and or family, and like you said, airfare. And if there are kids, there's tuition to consider because a lot of schools cover tuition for kids. So those are definitely factors to take into consideration when you're looking at different schools.
Well, yes, and housing may or may not be an issue depending on what region of the world you wind up. Because if you go to Europe, typically those schools aren't going to provide housing for you.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, if you go to other regions of the world, very often the expectation is that housing will be provided and generally is. But yes, that is clearly, as you indicate, Audrey, something that when we talk about trailing spouses, yeah, it adds those additional expenses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is some, and very often we can add here, I think, that some places where, depending on again what the trailing spouse's background is and profession, there could be something at the school
Hmm.
that might be made available for that individual, or they know of someone in the community who could really use the expertise that comes with with that spouse, and sometimes even those people are willing to help out with the travel and other benefits that could be made available to the couple. So you never know again what you encounter. Just understand that it could be sometimes again squared up against someone who doesn't have a trailing spouse or a number of children. Might be a factor in the decision making.
Right. So we know it's a whole big puzzle that you've been on the other end of things, the one doing the hiring, and it's a big puzzle to try to fit in people that meet all the criteria of all the jobs that you are looking for, and how does all that, go together. And we'll get into that more in a bit, but I wanted to check. So now you've talked it over, you've decided how open you are to trying different places or not, and you've thought about some of the considerations that you've already mentioned. So now you've made the decision, you're going to go ahead and make the application and get started. What are some of the next steps you would take?
Well, you certainly have a good resume prepared so that it presents itself well to whoever might be looking at your application. But another thing to really strongly consider and to be aware of, I've talked to quite a number of people who didn't recognize that there's a distinction between the Department of Defense schools and international private schools and also for profit schools. And I think you need to be aware of that. If you're going to go with the Department of Defense schools, and then you need to go through the U.S. Department of State, and because the Department of Defense schools basically serve the military, and in some cases they serve some of the foreign service employees depending on the again the specific locality. So be aware of that, and if you choose to go with the Department of Defense schools, understand you will likely be working with a different population, because very often in the Department of Defense schools you have the military personnel, as I just mentioned, and those students very often come from a little bit different background than many of the international schools where they might be made up more of executives who've been placed in the various countries by U.S. corporations and whatever. And so those students come from a different orientation. I think it's fair to say that if you wind up at a Department of Defense schools, it's going to look more like a public school back in the States. So be aware of that distinction. They are both very, I think, very worthwhile and grand places to teach, but be aware of that distinction. The other distinction you should be aware of as you're making application and pursuing this, there's a difference between schools that are non for profit and schools that are for profit. Many people like to stay away from the for profit schools. I wouldn't suggest that you do that. I would just suggest that you look carefully and wind up asking some questions about how that particular school has treated employees, because sometimes, as I have learned with the for profit operations, the owner wants to be really careful in terms of any resources that wind up getting placed in the classroom, or they may be very interested in hiring beginning teachers but aren't so interested in retaining people for any given time because you get expensive. You work your way up the salary schedule. And then there are for profit schools, of course, that are very aware of that and treat their employees wonderfully, have good benefits, are well resourced, and whatever. It's just worth asking the questions that should be asked before you decide to do that. And then also be aware that sometimes when a school calls themselves international school as opposed to American school or American international school, sometimes there's very little distinction between that. In fact, a school that calls themselves an international school may actually be more American than another school that calls themselves an American school. So it's those terms get thrown around so loosely. So be aware of that. Again, it's worth asking the questions. And then for those of us, like I was in that same position, who wind up going international for the first time, it's really worthwhile to work through a search firm. There are some really reputable people out there with the Search Associates, International School Services, the University of Northern Iowa has a great recruitment fair annually too, Educators Collaborative. There are those search firms that are really well connected in the international school community and are very honest folks. And you can get some very good information from them. Another thing I would do, and I did that for 5 years, I was a employee of the Office of Overseas Schools, the Department of State. And the Office of Overseas Schools is a small office, but they have 6 individuals in that office that cover the various regions of the world. And they get to know the schools very, very well. In an example, I was assigned Eastern and Western Europe. So I traveled all of the way from Ireland to Azerbaijan and landed in every one of those countries.
Wow.
So you not only look at the school where many Americans go, but you also look at other schools because sometimes employees have an interest in attending schools that's not so American to them. And so you want to be aware as a regional education officer of what those schools might be. So, an example, when I landed in Frankfurt, I, of course, looked at the Frankfurt International School, which is where most of the consulate people wound up sending their students. But I also looked at other international schools in Frankfurt that I became very familiar with. So that is a resource that I don't think enough people take advantage of. You can call that office and say that you're thinking about going to Frankfurt. Okay, what can you tell me about the schools there? What can you tell me about that school that I'm currently thinking about making application to? So I've said a lot of things here in my answer here, but understand again, trust the people that are available, that have been in this business, that are credible, because they tend to be really upfront and honest. They don't want to get the international school community to some degree is a small organization, relatively speaking, and the word gets out quickly. If there's a recruitment agent or agency that doesn't treat people well or is not forthcoming and honest, with whoever it is that they're working with. And so trust those folks and take advantage of that Office of Overseas Schools, because those folks, even though that's not their primary responsibility, their primary responsibility is to work with foreign service employees that are going over to work with the embassies and the consulates and let those families know what schools are available. But they're such good people, and they're international school educators typically. And so they know so much about every one of these schools that you're likely to be applying to. So take advantage of that.
I just love that tip. That's not something that we ever would have thought of, I don't think. Would you have thought of that, David?
No, no. And I remember one of the heads of school, well, back to Saudi, Jack Davis. I think he went to that office afterwards too. So I do remember hearing about it, but I'm going to investigate that. So thank you, Bob.
You're welcome. Yes. And again, just know those people are going to be so anxious to help out. They're not going to say, well, that's really not something we do. Those folks are, again, they're international school educators that have decided to take a job with the Office of Overseas Schools.
How do we get a job doing that, Bob?
Well,
I can ask you that another time, but
yeah,
that's fascinating. I love that idea that you went from Ireland to Azerbaijan and knew like just about every international school in between. I'm very envious of you for that.
well, yes. And so I was fortunate in that respect. And there are 6 regional education officers that cover the world. Yeah.
Fantastic.
All right. Another thing that I want to encourage candidates to do is to check whether the school is accredited by one of the really reputable accrediting agencies. The U.S. has a number of them. The Western Association of Schools and Colleges, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, where they wind up accrediting both K-12 schools and the colleges, along with in Europe right now, there's a Council of International Schools that very often winds up teaming up with some of the American accrediting agencies to take a look at schools that are looking at startup schools, particularly. But again, look for that to see whether the school has received, certification from an accrediting agency. I mean, it's very easy to find out. Many of them have it on their website. But they certainly, if you're working with an recruitment agency or whatever, they will know whether a school is accredited. And many times, the recruitment agencies will not work with schools that aren't accredited. So if they don't have accreditation, they are not necessarily invited to the recruitment fairs. Okay. So one other thing I'd want to add with that, when you're looking for positions, is that again, in the current environment, with the technology being so accessible, there are many schools who do not come to the recruitment fairs any longer because they feel they can do it all via technology, and candidates coming to visit them if they get invited. So even though a job may be posted, it doesn't necessarily mean that that school is going to show up at a recruitment fair that is offered in the States. So I think keep that in mind that so many jobs right now, particularly with the well established schools, are being filled and via the technology, via people coming to visit their school, as opposed to them having to show up at recruitment fairs. The other thing, by the way, I would say that I probably should have mentioned previously was for candidates doing their research going overseas, they need to be aware that there are really differences in terms of regions that you wind up in. In other words, Middle East, Southeast Asia, particularly, they're going to wind up probably, there are places in South America, though, too, that are going to compensate you better than other places. And so be aware of that, and you will typically get housing when you wind up going to this. If you go to Europe, it's rare that you're going to wind up landing a school that will provide housing for you.
Mhm.
I mean, they have learned that they don't need to do that because there's so many candidates from Canada, the United States, and elsewhere that want to go to Europe. they have learned that they don't really need to provide housing. And understand that the taxes are going to be, but that again depends on how long you're going to be staying. But if compensation is important to you, be aware of some of those circumstances, that their conditions, the living conditions are really going to end, and the working conditions and the salary can really vary from one place to the other. And typically, larger schools are going to be able to pay better than smaller schools. I mean, that is just something for you to be aware of when you're, again, exploring different regions of the world. Please know that there can be a vast difference from one region to the other in
Mhm.
terms of, again, the benefits, the salary, the living conditions, the housing, and in many places, it's an example. And Audrey, you know this, when we lived in Singapore, but in other regions of the world, you could hire domestic help, so it's just so inexpensive. And so if you're coming with two children or something, I mean, that can be tremendously helpful to have somebody living there with you, to take care of the kids during the day, something that might not be available to you in another region of the world. And it's much more difficult to arrange if you're going to Europe than
Mhm.
if you go into like the Middle East or particularly Southeast Asia. Well, that was a bit of a bird walk. I'm sorry for that.
Well,
Oh no.
I felt I needed to throw that in because it may be something you simply can't assume that one region of the world is similar to the next region of the world in terms of living conditions and even medical availability and that. It's all worth checking out very carefully. And again, as we mentioned previously, there are any number of resources. Again, if you're going to recruitment search firms, they will have good information for you. I mentioned the Office of Overseas Schools. Those individuals will have such good information for you and are going to be willing to talk with you about this. So take
mhm.
advantage of that.
Actually, to your point about making sure that it's the right fit financially and so on, all the different aspects you might be looking for. When you think about it, it's a pretty crazy thing we're doing. We're on a leap of faith going to a place we've never seen, being at a school that we've never seen. And it's a really big thing. So the more research you can do, the more you can find out about what you're getting yourself into, the better, for sure.
Yes, and if you're coming from the public schools in the States, or I suspect the same is true in many other countries, you have been involved in the state retirement program. And know when you go international, you're not likely to be in a retirement program of any kind, but they do contribute towards your retirement. But you're going to be responsible for doing the investing and that. And so, again, be aware of that if that's something that's important to you.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bob, you pretty much segued right into a big question that I had for you, just comparing regions. So I am curious about, and I know it's generalizing, but looking at the three regions where you were in managing schools, is there a different approach if you're in Southeast Asia, expectations, parental involvement compared to the Middle East, compared to Europe, and societal influences as well? Can you speak to that?
Well, for me, there wasn't so much difference in terms of parental expectations and whatever.
Hmm.
They, in all of those international schools, they're very diverse. You get families from all over, and so there tend to be, they value education, they're achievement oriented, and so you wind up getting pressure in all of those places in terms of making sure you're putting on a good program, because most of those families are very interested in sending their children on to colleges and universities. They want them to be well prepared. So that's clearly one issue. That it's not a whole lot different. The other thing, from a management standpoint, though, it is very different operating a school like in Southeast Asia and the Middle East compared to Europe. Europe, the unionization is much stronger. Okay, so if you have an example, if in Singapore I wanted to release someone because I just didn't think they were the right fit anymore, or they've lost their enthusiasm for their work, I could, let them know that this is probably going to be the last year for you here. Trying to do that in in the most respectful way possible, but it had to be done. Where in Europe, that is not such an easy thing to do. If you chose to do that, release someone, you would likely be, unless it was just really egregious behavior on part of someone, you'd likely be involved in the court, and it would involve a fairly substantial sum of money to release an individual. So that can be, in terms of, again, you ask from the management perspective, that was a huge difference for me in terms of having to just, well, you adapt, you work in those environments then. But it is clearly for those individuals who are looking to go into management, you're going to find that to be more challenging if staff needs to be released. And I always, if there was staff needed to be released, I always started with the administration.
Hmm.
Because you don't want the staff to begin thinking, why are you down here picking on the kindergarten teacher when you've got administrators that are clearly not doing the job and you're not dealing with that. So I mean, that's advice to those administrators that might be listening to this. you,
Hmm.
you know, be careful about that. If it's necessary to release staff, make sure you've got your own house in order in terms of your administrative team. Yeah.
Big
So
time.
Makes
well, I
sense.
could go on that stuff, but that's enough.
Well, one of our guiding principles is eyes wide open, and that what you're saying has carryover towards the culture of a school.
Yeah,
If
clearly.
folks know that they can play the game of doing the minimum and that it would be too much to try to push them out, it can really change the energy and the camaraderie. So that's definitely eyes wide open for folks. And we're talking about a whole region. So as always, dig deep, research each school, and find out what the inside scoop is.
Yeah, and recognize how, I mean, we all know this, how very, very important the leadership is, because that can make an incredible difference in terms of the culture in a school. You want to be able to wake up in the morning and look forward to going to work. And if you can't do that, very often it's the leadership that's responsible for some of that. Even if you've got team members that aren't easy to work with, it's again something that the leadership should probably be addressing. Is there an individual or two in that team that really is making it difficult for the others? And very often you can tell that because as soon as there's an opening elsewhere, they ask to transfer to get away from a
Mm,
particular team member or whatever. So I mean, leadership is just so incredibly important.
absolutely.
All right, Bob. So the next question, we're leaning in this interview towards people new to international education, but I'm wondering with this one if you can answer it for folks that are new and folks that are veterans. So here's my question. Should candidates reach out to schools that they're interested in directly? Should they be emailing them? Or is it best just to depend upon your search agency that you're working with and attending the fair? So, what routes would you offer folks?
Well, I would, as a first time overseas, I would definitely contact the recruitment agencies because I think they could be so helpful there. However, the terrain has changed in the times that all of us have been involved in international education. And as you know, there is so much interviewing that takes place via Zoom or whatever piece of software gets used. And so I would really pursue both. I would never have a hesitation in sending my resume directly to any school that you have an interest in. I mean, any school that eliminates you because you did something like that, I'm not so sure you'd want to work there anyway. So, in my view, there is no downside in pursuing both channels when you're starting out, particularly to work with at a recruitment agency. It's good that they get to know you, and also to apply directly. So I mean, that's my recommendation is there is just no downside in my view of pursuing both avenues.
Okay.
So then this question follows on with that directly. We've talked about Singapore American School where you and I work together. How does a school like SAS handle the huge influx of applications that they must see.
Well, like SAS, I'm sure what they're doing now, what we did to a limited degree when I was there, was use the human resource department. And the director and the principals will give that human resource department some guidelines and say, here's the type of candidate I'm looking for with this experience, with this background, and whatever. And please do the vetting of the resumes through that lens. And so I think that that's basically what most of the, particularly the larger schools, are doing that wind up getting so many applications. So I think be aware of that. The other thing that is happening, again, since this transition is taking place with more people being interviewed with the technology that's available, is there is a lot of word of mouth stuff that goes on. In other words, when I had a vacancy in this school, well, I would do two things. I would ask teachers that are working at the current school, have you ever worked with anyone that you think might be interested, that is really good, would be real credit to our organization, that you think would really fit in nicely here? The other thing is, you got word from a head of school who, so I'm saying this just so you are aware that some of that stuff is taking place in the background. And so any position that's listed isn't necessarily going to wind up really pursuing someone else. Okay, because I may get a call from a head of schools from another school and say, hey, Bob, this couple or this individual is leaving us. They just want another experience in a different part of the world, and you should really consider taking a look at them. Okay, now if it's a head that you trust and have confidence in, you're going to do that. You're going to visit with that couple and with that individual. And so, very often, even though it may be listed with a recruitment agency, it closes up before you even get a chance as somebody from the outside, again, first time, particularly going overseas, to have an opportunity for that. I mean, these are things that are going to be happening in the background that you're not necessarily going to be aware of, but are very real possibilities. So, but again, answering the question directly, it's done both ways. Audrey and David, they'll work through their human resources department. They may be in direct contact with the recruitment agency, along with the other stuff that is taking place that I just talked about.
Right. And I think currently there's even the level of, like you said, teachers should register with the recruiting agencies. They vet to a certain extent, like you have to put information in there. And so I think that, that helps to filter a little bit the jobs that are even getting to the school. And then a lot of schools also have an additional, whether it's linked to a recruiting agency or not,
On
but
their
an
website.
additional on their website where you also have to, some schools, like I know Singapore American School, has you send a video of yourself teaching. And then there's also kind of a video interview, I guess you could say, where it's not live. You're being taped, but you're answering questions that are being given to you in the moment, almost like an interview. And I think that that helps them speed up the process because it's much quicker, I think, to vet and go through those asynchronous kind of pieces of information than actually to sit down. I'm just imagining, I haven't been the one in charge of interviews, but when you sit down with someone, I think you probably, you're not going to cut them off after 5 minutes and say you're clearly not a fit here. Or maybe you do, I don't know. But it just seems to me like being able to look at something that someone has submitted probably speeds up the process.
Yeah, sure.
But I know that there's a lot for, especially the bigger schools like that, a lot for them to go through.
Okay, Bob, in your experience as the person doing the interviewing, what are some clear do's and don'ts for teachers and administrators too looking for jobs before, during, and after an interview?
Well, certainly before, you want to make sure that the basics are covered, like don't have any spelling and grammatical errors in your resumes and in your letters. I'm using plural here because many times it's a couple that's winding up applying or whatever, but regardless, you want to make sure about that because particularly a lot of the good schools get a lot of applications and then they look at, well, how do we go about screening this? Yeah, and sometimes they use that very basic stuff. Well, did the candidate or candidates concern themselves enough to review what it is that they just wrote or designed? And so I think that that's something that people need to think about. You don't want to give people any reason to eliminate you. And that is one of the things that certainly is looked at. Does it appear like there was some carelessness or sloppiness in terms of that? The other thing in terms of interviewing is that this is going to go to a couple again, to make sure that one of the couples doesn't speak a whole lot more than the other one. Sometimes I can tell when there's a little bit of concern about one spouse feeling that the other is a bit too reserved or whatever else, so they want to double up and really be aggressive in talking and don't let the spouse speak enough. And so I think you need to be careful about that. Talk that through before the interview, how it is that you're going to be responding to the questions, and make sure that you give deference to one another. That so that's an issue. And then sometimes I think be careful about why it is that you want to go international. It should be more than, well, I once knew a boyfriend who, or had a sister, who did this. And I mean, that's okay to work into it, but be careful not to use that too strongly. But it's your own curiosity that has led you to this point in your life where you're just simply wanting to explore other regions of the world and opportunity to teach elsewhere, that kind of stuff, as opposed to relying too much on, well, a friend or a brother or a sister talked about that. And then also be careful not to run down the place that you're currently working at. I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's sometimes happens. I have found that people are pretty good about that, but it has happened a number of times where people just and it may be true, and maybe you can state that in a fashion, that I'm having some discomfort where I'm at right now because I'm feeling that the leadership isn't what it might be, and I just simply need another challenge in my life, and I may as well take that challenge internationally, and
Mm-hmm.
again, my curiosity leads me that way. So if you have to say anything about that, I would frame it in that context as opposed to running down the way they're actually running the place. And that, there's enough good stuff to talk about that you don't need to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
And then be sure to understand that most of these schools really want, individuals that are willing to give some extra time. So this willingness to take on extracurricular activities is just going to be very important to most schools. Even though typically they have people on staff who can handle those activities, many of them, after a few years, want out and are hoping that the administration can find people who are step in and willing to take over some of those responsibilities. I mean, a particular one that seems that all schools wind up looking for so often is yearbook advisor.
Oh, yes.
Oh boy.
That is one that generally I think most administrators, when they hear that somebody has an interest in that, that certainly
Golden ticket.
makes a connection. But also, more generally, just a willingness to give you, whether it's as an advisor, to clubs, whatever, running a debate team, handling extracurricular coaching. So that is always something that can give you a 60-40 edge over someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that maybe that's enough on that issue. But if you cover those bases and make sure that you allow your personality to come out, because administrators want people who are gregarious, who they can vision being in the classroom and really enjoying being with kids and that. So be sure your personality comes through, but of course, don't fake it. Yeah.
Definitely.
I might say the other thing is be careful not to ramble too much in
Oh, yeah.
your in answering the question. Get the question answered, and don't go on so that you begin losing the interest of the interviewer.
I've heard people saying that by the time you've gotten the interview, it's less about what your skills are. they already believe you can do the job. It's more about, like you said, how you present yourself and are you a good fit for their school and their community. So I think that's very well stated to, let your personality shine through and be willing to take on extracurriculars and things. Do you have any advice for after the interview, follow up type things?
Well, there's never any harm in sending a note.
Hmm.
And so I think it's amazing how few people do that. I just express, appreciation for the time the individual took with them in the interview. And so you know that that's never going to do you any harm and can do you a world of good, because sometimes it really is one of these deals and where, gosh, both of these candidates were so exceptional. Now, which one do I choose? And that note coming in, if it's a written note or even an email note, text, that could make a difference sometimes in making a decision when, particularly when, if all things are even.
Well, those are a lot of really helpful tips for people to follow. So let's imagine a teacher has accepted a position. What advice do you have as they get ready to transition from teaching in North America to teaching overseas?
Well, be sure that you understand what it is that your assignment is going to be, and so that you prepare yourself well for that.
Hmm.
It may be that you're going to wind up teaching something you've never taught before.
Oh, yeah.
Right, but it is something you've decided that you can do and are willing to do, and so make sure that you prep yourself well for that. I would also think about where you're at currently. An example: is it possible for you to take a leave of absence rather than resigning? I have had this happen any number of times, and where it simply didn't work out for people. It isn't what they expected, or something happens at home. A family member gets ill, very often a parent, and people feel like they need to go back, and can't stay any longer. It's really nice to have a place to go back to. So if you can take a leave of absence, I mean, even if you can, let's assume you take a 2 year leave of absence. And then after that, you can decide whether you want to resign, or maybe the district's even willing, or the school is willing to give you another extension on the leave of absence. So it's worth asking that question. And so, well, people say sometimes, well, that's not really cutting the strings. You're always going to be, drawn back to that. Then if you know you've got that going for you, you're less apt to want to make it work. Well, I'm assuming you're mature enough not to let that happen to you. So it can be a real benefit, because we never know what might happen in terms of, again, primarily health issues, that happen with family members, and it could happen also with the couple or individual teaching. Internationally, something could happen where you're feeling because of your health you need to go back. So I would at least ask that question of the current school you're with: is it possible for me to take a leave of absence?
You're making me think about there's also, of course, things that are totally uncontrollable, like force majeure or environmental disaster, looking at the people recently in Pakistan where everything's just flooded out. There's nothing you can do about that. So, yeah, if you possibly could have a job to go back to, that's excellent advice.
Yeah, particularly if it was one that you enjoyed, that you found stimulating, and you wouldn't have looked elsewhere in the States or wherever you're coming from,
Hmm.
other countries. I mean, why not?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
All right, so we're going to move on to another topic in just a second. So, kind of leaving our listeners with just some maybe general advice. You're new to international education. What are a couple more pieces of info that you'd want people to think about as they make that transition?
Well, talk to as many people as you can. Ask wherever it is that you're going to be hiring, are there some people that I might be in contact with? Current teachers who wouldn't mind, sharing some thoughts on what it's like to live there and work there. That could be very helpful to put you at ease, help you prepare better for your travel. In other words, what to bring, what not to bring, what you're likely to encounter in the living conditions. So I think that that's certainly one of the things right now. If you do your homework in that way, I think that that's primarily what comes to mind for me at the moment.
Well, that's also really good advice. Thank you for all your tips and tricks about people new to international teaching. Since you've got such a wealth of experience, as people heard in our intro, your bio information, it's really tempting when we get some of your vast experience on the show that we want to jump into another topic. So let's take a leap, shall we?
Oh, why not?
So, besides being a head of school in Southeast Asia, you were interim head of school at a school in Europe and one in the Middle East. Some of our listeners might not know what that would look like. What would be a reason why a school might need an interim head and what the job might be like if it's different from being a regular head of school and what circumstances might lead to it?
Well, in deciding to become a head of school, there's two things that primarily are involved with those positions being open. And one is certainly that there's dissatisfaction with the current leadership, and the school may want to make a change. And they decide that far too late in the game, and so they don't feel that they can post a position and get enough applications to get the best pool of candidates. So that's one. And another, which happens quite often again because of personal health reasons with the director, or with family members, or again, living with him or her, or back home, where they just decide they need to leave. And as much as they'd prefer to stay in the position, they can simply because of personal issues that come up. So that's typically why those interim positions come up. And there's one also in where the individual that they really wanted to replace this particular director wasn't available for 2 more years. And so they decided we want that individual badly enough so that we're going to go with an interim for that period of time, just to finally land the individual that we think will be really good for this school. And
So, Bob, we're going to close here, and I have to share the enthusiasm of my partner there. And it was 2 months ago, she was saying, I'm going to try to get Bob Gross on the show. And she started telling me stories just about you as a leader and as a person and your effect upon your community. And it was just such awe and wonder. So I've had a little taste of getting to meet you and hear a little bit about your experiences. So I'm just going to share a big thank you for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom. Hopefully, we're going to be getting this out to lots of newcomers and I think a lot of veterans making moves in different parts of their career can get a lot from this interview as well. So thank you, Bob.
you're welcome.
Thank you
Thank
so
you. It's been a
much.
joy for me as well. So appreciate all the best to you with your program here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David,
inviting you to travel
teach,
and connect with us.